Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateachershistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateachershistory, or shoot me an email, chris@ateachershistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. Hello, and welcome to A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me again today. Did you know that according to John Adams, only about 1/3 of the colonists supported the revolution when independence was declared? That the British had an opportunity to defeat the Americans at the battles of New York at the very beginning of the war? And that the Americans went behind the backs of the French during the peace discussions, directly violating their instructions from Congress. Did you remember all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because today we will review that and more in episode 72, Unit 3 Review Part 2. Because let's not pretend like we actually remember all this stuff. Last week, in part 1 of the unit review, we covered the devolution of the relationship between the colonists and the crown in the 1760s and into the 1770s. We reviewed the lead up to the war and the first actions, including Lexington and Concord and the Battle of Bunker Hill. I think at this point in the Revolution, it's important to consider the extremely difficult position many of the colonists found themselves in. I mean, they were English through and through. They shared language, customs, religion, bloodlines. Revolution was a drastic consideration. Just the notion of independence was nothing to be taken lightly. As John Dickinson famously said, quote, "Where shall we find another Britain?" Because, things weren't that bad, right? Also, okay, so let's pretend we do get our independence. Who then is going to rule the country? Almost every country at this point had a monarch. Was this one really going to be able to govern itself? On top of this, the wealthy weren't totally on board with giving the lower classes too much political power. That could threaten their financial futures. Also, what about the slaves? How will all of this independence talk impact them and their commitment to their owners and property in the South? And who exactly would they all choose to govern? Because if it's guys like Sam Adams or a firecracker like Patrick Henry, that would make for a pretty unpredictable future. But even with all of these very real and tangible concerns, the end of 1775 saw a budding nation that was ready to take their future in a different direction, even if they weren't totally sure what that was going to mean. In January of 1776, when word arrived that the British were sending Hessian troops, well, actually just German troops, not all of them were Hessians, but either way, the colonists were infuriated. The British had always associated these men with the looting, raping, and pillaging Germans of their nightmares. The idea that their king and parliament would stoop so low enough to hire Germans to kill colonists, was a sobering realization. Then, later in the month, Thomas Paine released his incredible pamphlet Common Sense. Using easy-to-understand language, which was a welcome respite to some of the verbiage of many 18th century writings, Paine relentlessly attacked King George III, referring to him as the, quote, hardened, sullen-tempered Pharaoh of England, and Parliament, crushing not just their actions, but also the entire concept of a monarchy and how the Americans needed to do everything they could to change their fortunes. According to Paine, ideas of reconciliation were nonsense. The die had already been cast, so to speak. Independence was the only choice, and it also just happened to be the best choice. Paine proclaimed that, quote, a government of our own is our natural right. Oh, ye that love mankind, ye that dare oppose not only tyranny but the tyrant, stand forth. With the momentum of common sense, the colonies began to take steps closer and closer to all-out independence in the spring of 1776. Congress unleashed privateers on British shipping, they opened ports to foreign goods, and local and state governments began to draft their own constitutions and talk about how they would form their state governments. And it was in June of 1776 when Richard Henry Lee introduced the resolution that called for independence to the Second Continental Congress. The Congress moved forward with assigning a committee to begin drafting this document, with Thomas Jefferson eventually being the one tasked with the majority of the work. At 33 years old, Thomas Jefferson was the youngest representative, but had become well known around political circles after his writing of the Summary View of the Rights of British America. Being from Virginia and being recognized as incredibly smart and a fantastic writer, he seemed like a solid choice. The official vote for this document was on July 2nd, and the adoption of it was July 4th. The Declaration of Independence was mostly Jefferson's. Franklin and Adams had a few edits to it, and the Congress toned it down a bit over debate and discussion, but from this point on, Jefferson would be forever known as the man who authored the most important document in U.S. history. Part 1 of the Declaration of Independence detailed the basis for declaration, creating a conceptual justification for the actions that they were taking. The second part then listed all of the crimes against the colonists and more or less laid all the blame at the feet of King George III, not Parliament. It wasn't much of an analysis of the impacts of the decisions, but more like a brief, including all of their complaints, one by one. Of course, not only was this document meant to justify their independence and convince many in the colonies to get on board with it, but they also wanted to justify their actions to the rest of the world. This was a way to sort of fill everyone in on what exactly had been going on between the colonies and their king for the past decade. And Jefferson knew that this would be his challenge. His ideas weren't new concepts, they had been considered by many for years, but Jefferson believed his responsibility was to, quote, place before mankind the common sense of subject, in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent. It was intended to be an expression of the American mind. And that it was. The British were furious when they read the Declaration, and they were determined to subdue their burgeoning rebels once and for all. And now the work really started for the Second Continental Congress. These men were charged with running a military and winning a war while fighting the most powerful nation in the world, at the same time trying to figure out how to create a government from scratch. A Republican one at that. But at least they did have some things going for them. They'd be fighting the war on their home turf, the British would have to ship men and supplies across the Atlantic Ocean, and they would have to try to tamp down a revolution that was based off of ideas and in some ways almost an invisible enemy. On top of this, something I've touched on in the past, many of these British soldiers didn't really want to fight in this war. I mean, the colonists are their own kin. This is not a conflict that they wanted to be a part of. It was truly a last resort. But as we know, it wasn't easy for the colonists either. Most of them had no or very little military experience. They had few weapons, no uniforms, no real idea of how to fight, and lacked the necessary discipline to get the job done. Oh, and don't forget that there was also no money, corruption in the supplies and logistics, and about 1/3 of the colonists were actively engaging in support for the British. Well, at least according to John Adams. But no matter the exact numbers, this war was setting up to be a brutal experience for those involved. One Connecticut Tory described the infighting of the patriot and loyalist colonists by recalling that it was, quote, neighbor against neighbor, father against son, and son against father. He that would not thrust his own blade through his brother's heart was called an infamous villain. This was a very real and sobering reality to many, with no better example than that of Ben Franklin and his son William. And now we get into the war itself. Since we last checked in with the colonial troops, they had withdrawn from Breedville and had been reinforced by artillery delivered from Fort Ticonderoga by Henry Knox. With cannons pointed directly at them from the high ground, the British in Boston recognized that maybe it wasn't the best place for them to be hanging out. They decided to head to Halifax to regroup and plan their next attack. Washington, knowing that it would come in New York, began to prepare defenses appropriately. In the fall, while Washington was getting New York ready to go, other colonial forces were attacking Canada, capturing Montreal in November of 1775. But Richard Montgomery and Benedict Arnold didn't have quite as much luck in Quebec, suffering an embarrassing defeat at the hands of the British on New Year's Eve, 1775. With the colonists reeling in Canada, they did everything they could to hang on, and the British, at least at this point, did not have the manpower to push them out completely. But that was somewhat of an afterthought for Washington, because he knew the fate of the Continental Army would be decided in the first major battles of the war, and it was going to happen in New York. Landing on Staten Island on July 2nd, General Howe, his brother Admiral Howe, and over 30,000 British troops were ready to end this war before it even began. They knew that they were able to overwhelm Washington and the Continental Army, and maybe, if they see the power of the British Empire firsthand, they will come to their senses. Why do innocent men need to die for this lost cause? The plan was for the British to take New York City and then blockade the Hudson, effectively cutting the New England colonies off from the rest of the colonies, which would have effectively ended any chance the colonists had at success. The fall of 1776 saw Washington lose consistently to Howe at the Battle of Long Island, the Battle of Harlem Heights, and the Battle of White Plains. Washington was desperately trying to hold on, knowing that his men lacked the discipline and experience needed, while also knowing that, in the end, his primary objective was just not to lose the war here in New York. And credit belongs to Washington. Following his loss at Brooklyn in August, he was able to retreat onto Manhattan Island. In retrospect, Howe could have fairly easily trapped Washington and his men on the island and eventually crushed them, but he didn't. In another defeat at Harlem Heights in September, Washington retreated again, this time further north. In these 2 months of fighting, there were numerous narrow escapes, some seemingly mind-boggling mistakes by Washington, and regrettable hesitation by the Howe brothers. But Washington and his men survived, barely retreating into New Jersey, hoping to put a little distance between them and the pursuing British. Washington and his council then spent November and December planning their next moves. With Howe camping in New York for the winter, George Washington set his sights on the Hessian camp at Trenton. Crossing the ice-clogged Delaware in one of the most iconic moments in American military history, Washington led the Continental forces on a Christmas march against the unsuspecting Hessian garrison, capturing over 900 men and, at least for the time being, reinvigorating his army with some desperately needed hope and momentum. A few days later, Washington outsmarted Cornwallis, scoring another small but important victory at Princeton. These two victories had little impact on the war strategically, but it cannot be overstated how critical these two victories were to the Continental Army in the winter of 1776 and 1777. On the verge of collapse and almost helpless, Washington was able to score these moral victories and once again live to fight another day. In the spring of 1777, more good news came for the Continental Army, and this good news was actually strategically important. Heading into the spring, General Howe had devised a plan for the British that he thought would get 1777 set off on the right foot. General Burgoyne was to come south from Canada, down Lake Champlain, and arrive in Albany. General St. Leger would travel east from Fort Oswego, and Howe would travel north to meet him in Albany. At this point, all three of their armies would converge in central New York, effectively taking the waterways, and once again trying to cut New England off from the rest of the colonies, which the British reasoned would be the beginning of the end of the Revolution. The beginning of the plan seemed to work well. Burgoyne was traveling south almost unopposed, scoring an early and critical victory by taking back Fort Ticonderoga. But over time, Gentleman Johnny's baggage train of more than 30 carts of personal possessions and the 138 pieces of artillery began to weigh him down. As Burgoyne was slowing down, St. Leger was just getting started. On his way east from Fort Oswego, he ran into an unexpected Patriot challenger at Fort Stanwix when Benedict Arnold showed up with 1,000 Patriot troops, scoring a surprising Patriot victory at the Battle of Oriskany, driving St. Leger back to Oswego. During this time, Howe determined that he wasn't really needed in New York. I mean, Burgoyne just took Ticonderoga with no issues. He was in great shape. He didn't need Howe's help. So Howe decided he'd bite the bullet and, camp for the winter in, Philadelphia. And to Howe's credit, he was able to take Philadelphia without too much resistance, fairly easily outsmarting Washington at the Battle of Brandywine and then marching into the city unopposed. Little did Howe know, though, his decision to choose selfish victory and a comfy winter quarter was going to severely cost him and change the entire dynamic of the war. As Howe was advancing towards Philadelphia, Burgoyne began to realize that St. Leger and Howe were not going to be making their way to Albany for support. Just south of Saratoga, Benedict Arnold and Horatio Gates had set up defenses that were going to prove to be, at least to General Burgoyne, impenetrable. When Burgoyne arrived, he ended up engaging them in two battles on September 19th and October 7th, known as the Battles of Saratoga, falling in defeat in both of them. During those 2 weeks, the Patriot ranks were swelling around Burgoyne, and he found himself stuck, far outnumbered and in no man's land. Burgoyne held out hope that Clinton and some reinforcements would come. At least he hoped for a while, but eventually gave up and surrendered on October 16th, waving the white flag and handing over 5,700 troops in the process. This victory cannot be understated. The victory at Saratoga was enormous for the Americans. There were celebrations throughout the colonies, with France taking notice and deciding to ally themselves with the colonists, totally changing the complexion of the war in the process. Now, France and even Spain were already contributing to the American war effort, and France would have likely gotten involved formally at one point or another, but this victory made their decision a lot easier. Now, to Lord North's credit, he tried to prevent the inevitable by making overtures to the Second Continental Congress prior to an official French alliance, but it was to no avail. France recognized the independence of the United States and agreed to make, quote, common cause and aid each other mutually. But this victory was short-lived for many of the Continental soldiers. The following winter was the infamous winter at Valley Forge, where Washington and his men camped about 20 miles outside of Philadelphia, suffering most of their time there. The Marquis de Lafayette observed that they, quote, had neither coats, nor hats, nor shirts, nor shoes. Their feet and legs froze until they turned black, and it was often necessary to amputate them. Whether it was this bad or not, who knows? But it wasn't the best time for Washington and his army. His men were miserable, there really was no victory in sight, and rumors began to swirl about ideas of replacing Washington with someone else, like, maybe Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga. Amidst the uncertainty, the Continental Army was hanging on by a thread. The supplies and logistics were a disaster, the men were miserable, Washington's authority was being undermined, and officers were resigning one by one, with hundreds of more enlisted men fleeing during the night. While Washington's army dwindled, it began to build back up in the spring, and with the logistical support of Nathanael Greene and the disciplined training of Baron von Steuben, the Continental Army emerged from Valley Forge far more capable and confident than they entered it. The spring of 1778 brought a totally new tone to the conflict. The British decided to move their camp to New York, and Washington put his new army in the field, fighting valiantly against Howe at the Battle of Monmouth. So much so that some Americans argued they could even claim victory. But that's probably a little generous. After this, the British decided to change up their strategy and begin to focus more on the southern colonies. Clinton replaced Howe as the commanding general of the British armies in the colonies. Clinton and many members of Parliament argued that having seen their northern strategy fail to gain traction, and with rumors of myriad loyalist supporters in the South, it seemed to make more sense to move their war efforts to the friendly confines down there. In late 1778, Savannah fell to the British, and throughout 1779, the British methodically took control of the colony of Georgia. The Southern plan was to begin in Georgia and then take each colony one by one, slowly working their way north. So far, so good. In May of 1780, things got even better, with General Lincoln surrendering 3,000 American troops to Clinton at the Siege of Charleston, the largest victory for the British in the entire war. With the British efforts in the South seemingly unstoppable and having just captured the entire American army in the South, Clinton felt it was safe to leave Cornwallis and about 8,000 men down there, while he traveled back to New York to run the operations. With literally no army in the South, the Americans relied on guerrilla militia bands to do their fighting for them, at least for a little bit. Men like Francis Marion and Thomas Sumter harassed and annoyed the bejesus out of the British, destroying their supply lines and disrupting as much as they could. The Americans decided they were going to provide these militia with the support they needed by appointing the hero of Saratoga, Horatio Gates, to build a new Southern army. But that didn't work out quite as planned. With Britain reeling from a couple of defeats at the hands of the Spanish, Gates was chomping at the bit to add to his enduring resume. The Battle of Camden, though, did not turn out that way. In June of 1780, the two sides met, and Gates and the Americans were absolutely routed, with Gates infamously running away as far as 180 miles from the battle. So, time to rebuild the army. Again? This time, the Congress wised up and listened to Washington, allowing him to appoint Nathaniel Greene to take over. You know, the guy he wanted to take over in the first place. With Greene in charge, things seemed to begin to fall in place for the Americans. A contingent of American militiamen scored a critical victory at the Battle of Kings Mountain, and the Americans began to slowly turn the momentum of the war in their favor. Greene decided to split his troops in two, putting Daniel Morgan in charge of the other half, which on paper seemed like a stupid thing to do. But Greene had intuition that if he split his men in two, Cornwallis would do the same. And he was correct. Cornwallis split his men and sent his number two, Banastre Tarleton, after Morgan upon hearing rumors that they were angling to take British forts in the west. In January 1781, Tarleton fell right into Morgan's trap at the Battle of Cowpens. In probably the most strategically brilliant battle of the war, the American forces destroyed the British, with Tarleton embarrassingly reporting his defeat to Cornwallis, who was beyond furious at his failure. Cornwallis at this point had had enough. He set off to find Morgan and crush him. Fortunately for Morgan, the British delayed a bit in their pursuit, and he was able to meet back up with Nathaniel Greene and the rest of the American army. Greene and Morgan then fought Cornwallis at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, a battle in which the British took the field, but suffered such heavy losses, it sure didn't feel like a victory. With Cornwallis heading north to Wilmington, North Carolina, and the Americans staying in South Carolina, slowly securing the countryside, this whole southern strategy didn't seem like such a great idea anymore either. Cornwallis decided that he was not just going to sit in North Carolina, but instead he was going to take action. He moved north to Virginia, and like in Carolina, over time, the local population and local militias began to turn the momentum of the conflict and make the British feel increasingly unwelcome. After some consultation with Clinton, Cornwallis decided to make camp at Yorktown, Virginia. And of course, as we know, the decision to camp in Yorktown, Virginia was a colossal mistake. While the British did control the waterways at the time, they underestimated the potential threat that the French Navy was eventually going to pose to them. Once word reached George Washington and the Comte de Rochambeau that Cornwallis was in Yorktown, they decided to act. With de Grasse bringing his fleet up from the West Indies and de Barras sailing his down from Rhode Island. Washington and Rochambeau were trying to determine what they should do next. Although his men pleaded with him to abandon Yorktown, at a time when he still could, considering Lafayette was the only thing between him and the wide-open Virginia countryside, Cornwallis decided to stay put. Now, the British Navy may have been able to stop the French fleets, but Admiral Rodney only sent part of the British fleet northward, which, led by Thomas Graves, ended up losing to de Grasse in September 1781 at the Battle of the Chesapeake. During all of this, Washington finally relented on the idea to take New York and agreed to head south for Yorktown, but not before tricking Clinton into thinking he was going to attack New York. Oh, Washington, you dog. When Washington arrived in Yorktown, he and his allied French forces were joined by Lafayette and all of the men aboard de Grasse's fleet, bringing the total number to over 17,000 men. Cornwallis tried to hold out for as long as he could, ignoring the obvious reality of the situation, and eventually capitulated on October 19, 1781, surrendering over 7,000 men and effectively beginning the end of the conflict. While small engagements continued for a while, the major fighting was over. This became official in September of 1783 when the Treaty of Paris was signed. And during the negotiations, things became a bit complicated. The United States was represented by John Adams, Ben Franklin, and John Jay, with Jay and Franklin doing most of the negotiating. While they were given instructions to do more or less to run everything by the French and do what the French suggested they do, the American representatives, ignored all of that, believing that the French did not have their best interest at heart because, well, the French didn't have their best interest at heart. John Adams, in referencing the French, complained that the Comte de Vergennes was, quote, trying to keep his hand under our chin to prevent us from drowning, but not to lift our head out of the water. The Americans then began to work behind the scenes, letting Britain know that if they would come with a favorable plan, the Americans would ditch the French and sign it. After all, who do you want controlling the Appalachian Mountains? The crazy French or us free trade-loving Americans? This ended up being a huge success for the Americans, allowing them to sign a separate peace with Britain in which they defined the American borders as the Great Lakes, the Mississippi River, and the northern border of Florida. The British also afforded the Americans some fishing rights and said that they would remove all troops with, quote, all convenient speed, which was a bunch of crap. But to return the favor of making promises that were not intended to be kept, the Americans promised the British that they would not get in the way of debt collection and recommend that all property that was seized during the war would be returned to Loyalists. The French couldn't believe how good of a negotiation the Americans were able to achieve, with Vergennes whining that, quote, the English buy the peace more than they make it. Their concessions exceed all that I should have thought possible. Playing the French and the British off of each other worked perfectly, and the American Commission returned home with a shockingly favorable treaty, just in time to get to work to build this new, awesome United States of America. Next episode, we dive back into the narrative, and we discuss the next steps for this new nation. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed.